Well, our reading this morning is from 1 Kings in chapter 19. 1 Kings in chapter 19. 1 Kings 19, and we're reading from verse 15. Verse 15. And the Lord said unto him, Go, return on thy way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when thou comest, anoint Hazael to be king over Syria. And Jehu the son of Nimshi shalt thou anoint to be king over Israel. And Elisha the son of Shaphat of Abel Meholah shalt thou anoint to be prophet in thy room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapeth the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapeth from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. Yet I have left me 7,000 in Israel, all the knees which have not bowed unto Baal, and every mouth which hath not kissed him. So he departed thence, and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing, with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th, and Elijah passed by him, and cast his mantle upon him. And he left the oxen, and ran after Elijah, and said, Let me, I pray thee, kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow thee. And he said unto him, Go back again, for what have I done to thee? And he returned back from him, and took a yoke of oxen, and slew them, and boiled their flesh with the instruments of the oxen, and gave unto the people, and they did eat. Then he arose and went after Elijah, and ministered unto him. And may God bless His word again this morning to our hearts. Where we left off last Lord's Day morning in the story of Elijah was where God has came to him whenever he was on Mount Horeb, and he asked him what he was doing here. And we did conclude last Lord's Day as to how that in verses 19 to 21, as to how Elijah was given a new companion in life. And we ought always to thank God for the companions that He brings into our lives, maybe as a wife, a husband, maybe as a son or a daughter, maybe as a neighbour or a friend. But God was going to give to this man here a new companion. We're told that they enjoyed fellowship, that whenever Elijah went into the wilderness, he left his servant behind, and Elijah was all alone. And it's not always God's intention to keep us alone. God knew that this wasn't good for Elijah, and so God gave to Elijah a job to do. And we read about this job in verse 15 and also verse 16, that there was to be the anointing of a king, and then there was another man called Elisha that was going to take over the work whenever Elijah is taken up by a whirlwind into heaven. This companion that God gave to Elijah was one that was like-minded. The two of them could enjoy fellowship together. They shared a common call from God, and they both wanted to see the Lord honoured and glorified. And it's always a wonderful thing whenever you find a couple, whether it be husband and wife, or I know that sometimes there's maybe ones with unsaved partners, and maybe as a daughter or a son or a neighbour, and that companion is going to help you because they're like-minded whenever it comes to the things of God, and all they have got in view is that God would be honoured and glorified. We should always thank God for the fellowship of the saints, because how desperately God's people need one another. And so Elijah was given a new companion. It was going to mean that there was this fellowship together, and we're told that they enjoyed fellowship. And the latter words that we read this morning in verse 21, we read these words, and ministered unto him. They were also going to enjoy friendship because God knew the burdens that Elijah was carrying. He was aware of them, and that they were too heavy for Elijah to carry on his own. And so God put this man into the prophet's life to help him along. That word ministered, and I just say this by way of introduction this morning, it means to attend to contribute to, and also another rendering is to serve. This describes the kind of friend Elisha was going to be to Elijah. He filled a void in the life of this man of God, and he helped Elijah fulfill his task and his calling. My topic this morning, because I realize that in the life of Elijah, that Elijah is not on his own. We've looked at Obadiah and how that God had Obadiah and used Obadiah, and we've covered that aspect of Obadiah in the life of Elijah. But there's someone else in his life, and that is very much so now. This man that is going to receive the call, and he's called Elisha. And just today, if you were talking about yourself or someone else, maybe you'd find it very difficult just to talk about yourself. You'd have to talk maybe about someone else that is very much involved in your life, and maybe in your work or even in your family. And so we covered last week as to how Elijah has been sitting in depression, and we dwelt on that, and we said that there is, of course, medical reasons for depression. But depression can also become a crutch whenever someone is out of touch with God. And I clarified that last week, and if you want that clarification, I know the Stuart's recording it, so exactly what I have said will be on that recording. We find that the word came to Elijah, what are you doing here? Get up, return, and get back into the work of God. And that was a very, very clear direction, because he was to go and he was to anoint Elisha. And so in this passage here we have the call of Elisha and how God called him. Now Elisha was going to, as I've mentioned earlier, be his successor. He's going to take over from the prophet Elijah. We've already covered the aspect as to how God's work does not depend on any one of us. The work of God is much bigger than any pastor, any layman, anyone else. It's a much bigger work. And Elijah's work is coming to an end. He's going to be taken eventually by a whirlwind into heaven. But God has already got his man Elisha that is singled out to carry on the work of God. We don't know what age he was at this time. We don't know where he was born, but we do know the place where he was from. This place, Abel Meholach. An unusual name, but Elisha's name simply means God is salvation. He was the son, we're told, of Shaphat of Abel Meholach. This place where he was as described as coming from at this stage in his life, is the literal meaning is the place of dances. That's what it means. And or the valley of dances. It was a festival place. It was a place where there'd be many parades, there'd be successions, there'd be festivities, there'd be celebrations, and they'd all take place in this place, Abel Meholach, the valley or the place of dances. He seems to come from a very wealthy family, because we're told that they're ploughing and they have 12 yoke of oxen, which was an awful lot to own back at this particular time. We're told that there's 12 teams of oxen, and this man here, he's at the last one, he's at the 12th. We see also that this is the place where his father has placed him in charge, as it were. He's in a place of authority whenever God is going to call him. Because he was in charge of the 12th team, the 12th yoke of oxen, we're told that Elisha's family's wealth didn't allow him idleness. You know, I'm sure that there are many will agree today that we ought always to teach our children never to expect everything to be handed on a plate. We ought to teach them the ethic of work. We ought to teach them that there's so much to be learnt, even in work, and whether that work is involved in gardening or doing some chores around the house or whatever, or delivering newspapers or whatever, there ought to be some ethic of work that is instilled into our children. And so this man here, Elisha, is from a very wealthy family, but it's not been handed to him. He's taught to work as a young man. And we know that he's out ploughing in the field, he's doing the work, he's bringing growth to the farm, and that's where he is. He's not sitting in the house, we're told. He's out in the field, he's working whenever God called him. And so God is going to bring this man into the life of Elijah, and I want you to notice, first of all, this call that came to him. You see, Elijah's ministry does not end whenever the call came to Elisha. You see, we're told that Elisha would become Elijah's servant. Another rendering is he was going to become the assistant or the student, and he was going to continue in this role for several years. Elijah was going to be the mentor to this prophet Elisha. And so we see that there was a two-way friendship that was developing between them. Now, Elijah ministered to Elisha, and Elisha became a great comfort and a tremendous encouragement to Elijah. You see, at one time Elijah had thought that he was all alone. He was the only one to continue on the work of God. Whenever he was reminded there's 7,000 yet that still haven't bowed the knee to Baal. Let us never think that we as God's people are the only ones that worship God. There are other people who worship God in different styles of worship than maybe we worship. We go to different countries, perhaps. You could go maybe to different fellowships. But the one thing that ought to always unite is the cross. We're redeemed with precious blood. And so in this friendship here that was one of comfort and encouragement, God is going to bring this man Elisha out of hiding. And he's going to bring Elijah, in a sense, out of his hiding, and the two of them are going to go on a tour, as it were. Because we're told that until this stage, that God's people were hiding in caves. That's where they were hiding. They were afraid to come out and speak for the Lord. But after Elijah's experience with God in Mount Horeb, he begins travelling all over the country, teaching in these schools, the schools of the prophets, which were Bible colleges, modern day Bible colleges, but they were called the schools of the prophets. And Elisha would be his attendant. Elijah has been restored to a new understanding as to how God works, because we're told in verse 19, so he departed thence and found Elisha the son of Shaphat, who was ploughing with 12 yoke of oxen before him, and he with the 12th, and Elijah passed by him and cast his mantle upon him. You see, the prophet left the mountain and he finds Elisha. The anointing of the kings, and that was mentioned in verse 15 and 16, that was going to come at a later stage. But for this stage, he was to anoint, he was to cast his mantle upon the next man that would take over from him, which is Elisha. Elijah first went to find Elisha, who became the encouragement to the prophet, but there was a cost that was involved in Elisha's call. It was Jim Elliot, and I know that it was on television, I'm told, some time ago, but I watched it on the internet, and I watched it again the other day. Jim Elliot's daughter, and she talks about how her father, as a missionary, went out to these Yucca Indians, and how that he was brutally killed along with a number of others. You ought to watch that interview with the daughter. And she quotes her father. She said, yes, there's times I'm sad that I've grown up without a father. My father was killed by those Indians. But you know, it was Jim Elliot, that coined that phrase, Jim Elliot, the young missionary that died so young, he is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And she talks in that interview as to how the family forgive the killers. And of course my Bible tells me if we do not forgive, we are not forgiven. I don't think you can read the Scriptures without realizing that there's no forgiveness for us without us forgiving. And God obviously has given to that family remarkable grace in those circumstances. And they certainly have proved God. Elisha, from this prosperous background, he's a little bit like Peter and Andrew, because Peter and Andrew were from a very wealthy background too. Their father owned a fishing business. However, in the light of this wealth, it meant nothing to him in the light of God's calling upon his life. I want you to notice that there were at least two things that this man considered whenever God called him. He considered his parents. You know, the Bible tells us, young people, we ought to respect our parents. Honour our father and our mother, that our days may be long upon the earth which the Lord thy God giveth thee. We ought to respect our parents. As parents, he considers them. He considers as to how the call of God is going to affect his parents. The second thing that he considers, and that is his position. Because there was stability in knowing what he was doing, going to do the next day. He's out ploughing, he knew exactly what he'd be doing, but whenever it came to the call of God, he knew that that stability was going out the window, as it were. And he was placing his hands, his life, in the hands of the great, omnipotent God. And so, his one aim was to serve the Lord. And so I want you to picture him one day, and he's out ploughing. Perhaps he's just doing his usual work out in the valley. He's with his horses, he's ploughing, and this rugged man comes down the mountain. And remember, if Elijah was coming to this fellowship today, there'd be those who'd be saying, put that man out. Put him out. Look at the way he's dressed. He was the prophet of God. He was God's man. He was God's man. And so Elijah comes down the mountain, we're told, this rugged man, and he's wearing a mantle, and the mantle is of sheepskin. Now, Elisha knows who he is, because he recognizes that this man coming down the mountain while I'm ploughing, this is the prophet of God here. And we're told as to how he responds to the call. He was a man of faith, no doubt. In verse 20 we're told, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah. It all seemed to happen fairly quickly. He was a man that certainly knew God. He had developed biblical values and priorities which controlled his life. Maybe today the mission field is so barren. So many churches without pastors, so few evangelists. And maybe it's because that there's so many today maybe not willing for the call of God. Maybe not listening for the call of God. But Elisha had already developed these godly priorities in his life. And that was no doubt one of them was seeking first the kingdom. He was willing to be uprooted from his quiet, peaceful and rural life with all his financial security that he had at home. He was willing to be uprooted from it all and to go out and start to follow Elijah. He was going to be his mentor. Now it's interesting to note how many great men of the Bible were called to some special ministry after they demonstrated their ability and a willingness to work just exactly where God had placed them. They've demonstrated faithfulness and loyalty. Think of Moses. Moses was looking after his father-in-law's sheep whenever God called him. David, he's also looking after the sheep when he hears the call of God. Peter's a fisherman. Amos is a farmer whenever God called him. Paul is making tents. He's a tent maker. Our Lord himself was a joiner by trade. And so I think that re-emphasizes the fact, again, that parents ought to teach children to work. I think it's very, very sad whenever you listen to the news these days and you listen about 4-year-old children needing psychiatrists and little troubled minds. And society is such that society is very, very cruel. It's very cruel. And those little minds that need help, but what kind of a system are we in? You read the UCB notes the other day, you'll have read about technology. You'll have read about the importance of conversation. Do you see this idea, dear friends, of families sitting around a table, whether it's in a restaurant or somewhere else, and everybody's sitting on their mobile phones, carrying on their own conversation, and no conversation amongst the family? There's going to be a terrible reaping. We're not spending time with our children. We're not talking to them. We're not letting them communicate with us and discussing things. And remember that even in a friendship, whether it's in the family or whatever, a friend is someone who tells us not what we want to hear, but what we need to hear. Someone that just confirms our own thinking and says, oh, I agree with you, this, that, and the other thing. They're not a friend. Someone that will challenge you and say to you, but that's wrong. You need to change. You need to check this in your life or that in your life. That is the true friend. That is the friend that loveth at all times. And so Elijah passes over him, we're told, and he takes this mantle of sheepskin and he throws it over the shoulders of Elisha. Now I understand that there was 3 types of mantle. But I'm not going to go into them all today. I'm going to dwell on the one that Elijah had and what it meant. This mantle here was the official garment of a prophet that was worn in biblical times. I understand it was the adoret. It was a cloak that was made of animal hair. And it was a garment of distinction worn by kings and especially by prophets, because we know that Elijah, we're told here in chapter 19 and verse 13 that this is what Elijah wore. And so this is what Elisha is getting. Whenever he gets this mantle that's going to be thrown over onto his shoulders, he's going to have the role of a prophet. This mantle automatically marked him as a prophet, a spokesman for God. It was also a symbol of sacrifice and was a symbol of commitment. I don't understand all the items that are used in some of these sermons or that, but I remember being at the Duke of Ed Award in the City Hall in Belfast for Jonathan. And it was very interesting to see that there was these banging of doors and there was ones with all these different robes and everything meant something different and so on. It would have been rather interesting probably to have studied as to the origin of all that. But you know, here we have this man here, and this mantle being thrown on him is a symbol of sacrifice, of commitment, the fact that he's a prophet. The life of a prophet was not a life of luxury. It represented a man's gift. It represented the call of God and the purpose for which God had called him. Throwing it over the shoulders of Elisha was a symbolic act denoting his summons to the office of prophet. Elisha, you're called now. You're now a prophet of God. There was also a sure sign of God's gift that enabled him to fulfill his prophetic office and ministry. It was immediately understood by Elisha without words. It was understood by Elisha that I'm called now. I'll say this, dear friends, today, that God never calls a man from idleness. Many perhaps go to college, many study, many want to go maybe into the work of God, maybe there are those who want to go into the ministry. God's call to Elisha was unexpected. He wasn't sitting in a library with his book and his pen and a notebook at his desk, analysing his life. He was in the field when he was called. God broke into his life and God called him. There's an old Puritan said this here: God saith not as man saith, neither does he choose man because they are fit, but he fits them because he has chosen them. I think there's so much in that. God saith not as a man saith, neither does he choose man because they are fit, but he fits them because he has chosen them. I'll conclude this morning with Elisha's response to the call. His response was immediate. Now he requests that he might go back and kiss his father and his mother. He requests that. But you know, dear friends, it's not that he was hesitant about going off in this role as a prophet. It was rather a decision which indicated the previous work of God in his life, that he's already settled in his mind. And so Elisha's request, it was prompted by at least two things. It was an act of genuine respect and honour for his parents. Honour and respect. It was prompted by a desire to celebrate his entrance into the ministry and confirm his commitment to follow the Lord, even before his friends and his family. I'm going to follow the Lord. I wonder, friends, are we there today? Those of you that are fathers, those of you that are mothers, that no matter what other people may seek to do, as for me, well, I'm going to follow the Lord because I'm going to be accountable to God. One day I will have to stand before God and give an account as a father or as a mother. Oh, friends, today, nail your colours to the mast. Don't be tossed about by every wind of doctrine. Let your family know exactly where you stand whenever it comes to the things of God. And so he has a genuine respect to honour his parents. We know, of course, that Jesus said that if a man's not willing to forsake or to renounce, rather, his mother and father, then he's not really fit for the kingdom. And the second thing that I want you to notice is, was prompted by a desire to celebrate his entrance into the ministry and to confirm his commitment here to follow the Lord. God's going to be first in his life. I wonder, are you there this morning? God's going to be first in your life. You see, the call was from God. The call was not from Elijah. And so Elisha is going to be accountable to God himself. And so I reckon that's why he wanted to do these things before he heads off with Elijah. Maybe there's someone here this morning and you're looking back. Remember what Jesus said. Having put our hands to the plough and looking back, we're not fit for the kingdom. We're not fit. No man that warrieth, Paul said to Timothy, entangleth himself with the affairs of this life. Now here's a man here, remember that he lives in the valley of Abel Maholic, the valley of dances. It wasn't just Elisha's family he was leaving a lovely place. He was leaving a place of rejoicing and celebration. It was a great place. It was the golden mile of the valley of Jordan. He was leaving his home. He's leaving his family. He's leaving his pleasures. Oh, you think of that mission field out there and the need that there is, obviously, for doctors and for all sorts of people. Wouldn't it be lovely if one day that God was to lay His hand upon those even in this fellowship and say, well, look here, I want you to leave all. I could take you to the seat in our church in Omagh a number of years ago, where the Reverend Dara was preaching, and he was preaching on opening your hands. And I remember God really dealing with me. Was I willing to open my hands if God wanted those lads of ours released into His service? And I remember sitting in that seat and saying, God, my hands are open. And shortly after that, which is 7 years ago now, Jonathan, of course, went over to England to the Christian Institute. But I believe today that there's parents and their hands are closed and they've it all sorted out. Their son's going to go this direction, he's going to become this, their daughter's going to become that. Our one aim as Christians today would be that they would find the will of God. Whether that's in Cookstown Council, whether that's working on roads or wherever, they might know the will of God. This man here, he's leaving his home, he's leaving his family, he's leaving his pleasures because the call of God has come. He separates himself, he took the life that he had and he handed it over to God. Let me ask you, dear friend, today, is your life handed over to God? I was very touched over these last 2 Sunday nights after the service whenever someone said to me a fortnight ago, going out of the service, I want to tell you I'm saved. And last Sunday night, going out of the service, someone stopped me. And they've never mentioned anything like this before in their lives to me. And they said, Mr. Patterson, I want to tell you something now. I am saved. I'm at home. Certainly for the step. Because that's all that really matters. That we're saved, that we know God, that we're walking with God. And so what does he do? He separates himself. He took his oxen, that which he had laboured with. He takes his livelihood and he slays them. There's no way back. He took the instruments and he burns them in the fire. And I would say, dear friend, what does he teach us? To give God our best. As we're all on the altar today, our careers, our finance, our time, our status, our health, our fame, our reputation, whatever category you may feel that you fall into, are you taking it today and saying, God, it's yours? And then verse 21 tells me that after he did this, then he arose and he went after Elijah. He knew he had the privilege of representing Elijah after Elijah would be raptured to glory. He was going to represent the work of God. And we're told that he served his master. He served the prophet. We're told that. He ministered unto him. He poured water upon the hands of the prophet Elijah. We read that over in 2 Kings. The oxen and the implements, the wooden plough with the yokes, it represented the tools of his trade and the means and the basis of his past life. He was showing his family and friends he has now new aims, new aspirations, new commitments and new values. What's he doing? He's burning the old bridges. He's burning them. In 2 Kings 3 and 11 he becomes the servant of Elijah. His time with Elijah was not only in education and theology, he was getting educated in a very practical ministry to others. He was learning about humility, about submission, about authority, about loyalty, about faithfulness, about obedience, of being a servant. And all this was vital. It was vital preparation for his ministry. Yes, the life that he was now embarking on was going to have plenty of discomfort. You know, and we'll have to cover Elisha. We'll have to intertwine him into the story of Elijah. Now, you remember the Bible tells us that Elisha was bald. Wouldn't you wonder nearly if the Bible even would give us all those facts. We're told that one day there's these young children and they come out and they laugh at him and they called him bald. And I know some people think maybe it was very cruel, but we will try to look at it. If God spares, what happens is there's these bears come out of the wood and they devour the children. What does that tell me? The Bible tells me, touch not God's anointed, do my prophets no harm. But we'll have to leave it there. I'll ask you again, myself included this morning, as our aspirations are all today just to serve God, whatever capacity God wants us to, until that day that He calls us home.